Turning your Bibles for the last time we're going to do 1 Corinthians 13 for a while. If you're flipping in your Bibles, while we're doing that, I want to stop and say thank you. If you haven't noticed, there used to be a large oak tree between here and the the parsonage. Wednesday night, it determined it had a long life and it was going to lay down in the road. And we did take some water in the church Wednesday. Fortunately, our sump pumps kept working. They couldn't keep up, but some folks helped us get that out, and some people pitched in, and we got the tree out of the way with the help of state DOT, and so very thankful for that, and very blessed in the midst of it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that through the service. I will tell you, please be in prayer for, I know our South Carolina disaster teams are being called out this coming week. I got an email this morning. And so I don't yet know whether I'm going, but I know my friends are going and packing up. And so they're going to be in Race City, Georgia, which is just north of Valdosta. And the hurricane was still really strong when it passed over Valdosta. And so that's how our church, the extended church, is heading out and where they're headed. People also always talk about what is it that you need for success in this world. There was this actress, something Hayes said, the one thing you needed, she's from the 30s and 40s. She wrote the book, My Life, in 3 chapters or 3 parts. She said, you need charm. That's the only thing you really need. And where I came from, the one thing I think they always told us you needed was a good work ethic. You could climb out of any hole that you might be in if you worked hard enough at it. Or you could climb the ladder of success, that somebody might say, if you worked hard enough at it. I think Paul would have said that he might have used similar words when he talked about love. And throughout the New Testament, it is obvious, and we've talked about it over the last few weeks, that loving other people matters. Paul would have used, I think, the same words. He does very clearly in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 13, that if you don't have this agape love that he's talking about, nothing else matters. All the missions in the world, all the service, all the giving doesn't matter for it's not worth a grain of sand, or about as useful as one drop of rain Wednesday night here in Holly Hill, because there was plenty to be had, right? He said nothing else really matters. Love is that thing which you either have it, or if you don't, nothing else much matters. So listen as we start in verse 4 and work down through 8. Talked about love is patient and love is kind. It does not. Now we start these things it's not, and he's going to list 8 of them. He says, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. We use the word irritable. It keeps no records of wrong. Love does not delight in evil. And then all of a sudden he starts to change. He says, but now it rejoices in truth. He's turned a corner here. He says it rejoices in truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always perseveres. Love never fails. When he starts to talk about these things, we've talked a lot about what love isn't. We talked about also how love was this act of, it was not passive. That our love couldn't be just sat on the sidelines. And then Paul lists these 5 things in which love is. It always rejoices in truth. The NIV says that Let me see if I can get it right. It says it always protects. The word protects there in the Greek or the Aramaic is, now how can I find it? Stego, S-T-E-G-O. It's a word that has multiple meanings. The other translation says that love bears with other people. It comes in and it bears their burdens. You know, the word heavy had a whole different meaning out here Wednesday night and Thursday morning. It seemed everything I touched or was involved in was heavy. The rain was heavy, the chainsaws were heavy, and that tree, when it got into chunks, was heavy to move. Heavy can mean this weight, but also the pressure can get heavy. Miss Dorcas is feeling the heaviness of the emotion of grief. The word heavy doesn't just mean that I've gotten fat. Now, it does mean that, but it's not the only thing it means. It talks about other spots, and so it is with that word. And so, when we have those things, and that's why I like reading other translations. I want to say it was the ESV that said that it bears the burdens of others, that love is that way. And so, we're going to look at both how love protects and love bears as we see what Paul talks about. So let me give you on the bearing part. Paul's metaphor would probably lend itself to a ship crossing the Mediterranean, and we know that the storms come very fast and they're big storms. That ship that all of a sudden is at the crest of the top of the wave. And then all of a sudden it's down. And if you've ever been out in the ocean where it was really choppy, and all of a sudden the boat slides down into the bottom, and it's between, you're like, when's the next wave coming? And that boat is still churning and groaning, trying to get to the other side of the storm. It's bearing all that it can to try to get to the other side. Sometimes our love needs to look that way. Wednesday night we saw a good example of it. A roof, our roofs hopefully bared well under the force of the wind and the rain. It served to bear the burden. Out in spots where they have lots of snow and we don't have to think about this as much, your roof structure has to be built in a way that it can handle this much pressure per square foot of roof. It's how much load of snow they think they can bear. At the beach, they build things to bear so many miles per hour of the wind, right? And so all of a sudden, love starts to bear with us. I spent 2 years at Winthrop University. When I first went to college, I ended up transferring back home and lived at the house and graduated from USC Spartanburg back then. It's now upstate, where I met my bride, Kay. But those first 2 years, I often think about these two people who played a really important spot in my spiritual growth. I didn't turn 18 till July 1 after my high school graduation. So I was barely 18, 6 weeks when I left for college. And us boys, we don't mature the fastest in the world to begin with. No, y'all should not be laughing. But it's true. But I was involved in campus ministries there, and there were these two people who were at the BSU. Bob Porterfield, and I cannot think of Dina's last name. He was the director, she was the associate director. I ended up being elected as an officer there, and I can remember going into our officers meeting early part of my sophomore year, and Bob was mad. He was so frustrated. He led into us. And he said, I do not want to know who did this. And then he told a story about what somebody had done that I never owned up to. He said he didn't want to know. I wasn't about to tell him it was me. I had been somewhere I shouldn't have been. And somebody saw me and they came back and said, well, why would we be there? Why would this person on your leadership team be there? And I was not the only one who did that. I was not the only one to make that mistake, but we made them. And you know, I think at times you would want to think that I don't know why Bob just didn't say, who is it you're done? Because that'd probably been my first reaction. But it wasn't Bob and Dina's. They put their arms around us. I still to this day don't know. Bob passed away a few years ago. I don't know if he knew that was me that they were talking about. He had every right to throw in the towel on a couple of us on occasionally. But nope, he stood there and took it. He stayed with us along the missteps and along the ways. I often think, because he's the guy who carried me as a sophomore late in the spring. We ended up in Hell's Kitchen on a mission trip with me at barely 19 driving the BSU van into New York City. That's the guy who put his arm around me and tell me what could be as I grew up. And telling me, he showed me and many others love through his willingness to forgive, to encourage when we didn't, to come alongside and pick up and to lift us up even when we couldn't help ourselves. See, love bears in, it leans in those cases. So the idea that love protects. On Wednesday night and Thursday, I got to see that as we encountered Idalia. Wednesday night when the tree fell and Kay and I walked out of the church, and when we walked in it was up. About 9:30, by 10 o'clock it was laying in the road. Those men had been up getting ready for the storm, and they were out in the middle of it. Hanks was out there trying to protect and see. They'd been on Gilmore to see somebody that was 92-year old extracted from her house because it was flooding. There was easily over a foot of water on Gilmore when I was on it. And they were out trying to figure out how to keep us as safe as they could in the midst of it. It starts to protect us. Love protects that which we care about. One of the wonderful things about people who love you is they will never intentionally and deliberately put you in harm's way of something that might hurt you. It's how I had my oldest son to actually ride roller coasters. Is he knew I loved him. He was scared of that Batman roller coaster where you sat on what looked like a banana bicycle seat. And he could see the ups and downs of that thing where your feet just hanging in the air. And I looked at him and I said, now JC, do you think I would ever put you in a spot of anything that would hurt you? He said, no. I said, well, then buckle up, Buttercup, and get on this roller coaster. By the way, that same speech did not work with my Hannah. It worked with him. He loves to ride still. But see, love is going to protect you as much as it can. Our children don't understand when we tell them no, right? That it's meant for their protection. Or when God tells us no. It's meant for our protection. Dr. Robertson Quillen was a missionary to Japan. He was also the president at Columbia Bible College here in the middle of the state. He and his wife kept this plaque. This tells you something about how it was, or the president's house there. It was in their living room, and it read, "The absent are safe here." Now, sometimes we get into conversations and we realize this is a comfortable spot, and then all of a sudden we say, well, that's all good, and all of a sudden we unload a little bit, right? All of a sudden we're saying negative things about somebody. Dr. McQuillan said, you know, there was more than once or twice that happened in our home. He said, but I just start looking at that plaque. I'd get quiet, start staring at that plaque. Sooner or later, they would realize I wasn't listening and I was staring at the plaque. And then somebody would read, even if they're absent, they're safe here. He said it was amazing how often the conversations changed in my living room. Sometimes our conversations need to be that way. For the last 14 years, I've been blessed as a pastor to be in a pastor's group. Randy Harling, he's the pastor at Somerville Baptist. He was the pastor that ordained me and experienced my call to ministry. We're very good friends. Kay and Sherry and me and Randy. There's been this group that we met with. Randy and I are the only two original members left. But you know, one of the things, we meet once a month. We go sit somewhere, and sometimes we have planned conversation, what we're going to talk about, how COVID has impacted us, or what we're reading. But other times, it's a safe place for us to be okay. I don't ever wonder whether I've been misquoted or whether somebody's told a story that didn't need to leave the room. It always protects us. It always takes care of us because there's a love there. And so it ought to be with us, that our love starts to protect and shield. It is that spot that we see that it goes beyond what we have. The next thing out of that verse was that love trusts. That love always trusts. As a pastor, I might be a cynic at times. I've been asked lots of things by people, non-church folks and church members. You kind of like, what's going on? I'll admit to that. It's a little hard. But the reality is that I ought to start from a place of love and trust in my life. One of the reasons I ask us to return places in mission trips, to go back to do something over and over, is because it builds relationships that can build trust. One-time random acts of kindness for missions, I get it. I've done them. We may do more. But I would rather do the things like going to the schools repetitively that happen over and over, because all of a sudden out of it, your love is seen not just one time. It's like, hey, they did it because John said so the first time you go. But the second, the third, and the fourth time, all of a sudden you start crossing barriers with people and they know to trust you. Wednesday night, standing out in the middle of Peak Street, you're running a chainsaw. Even after I told Hank was running the chainsaw, and I just said, would you give that to me? I did not say it near that nicely. I've been running the chainsaw longer than Hank's been alive, y'all. But because then for the next few hours, I ended up out with the City Boys trying to figure out a couple of things. And all of a sudden, there's relationships built, there's trust built, because you're in the middle of a mess. When you're in the middle of the foxhole with somebody. And it builds up trust because you can see it over and over. I see Betsy back there, and Betsy, you and I both would say 2 years ago when we got the first time I was on the soccer field with you, the girls at Orangeburg Walking Center are looking at me like, who is this guy? And the greatest thing at the end of the year was to have those young ladies say thank you and to hug me and ask me if I was coming back. And see, because when you go through life and you do those things repetitively, all of a sudden they see your love, and it builds up a trust for us that can overcome. That we can land in that spot of verse 8, that love never fails. See, a Christ-like love in the midst of all the things we experience, it does start to bear your burdens. When you come along when somebody's in that tough spot and you lean in and you take the weight off of them, it changes how they see and where you are. When you're protecting them, when you're standing between them and danger, between them and their pain, they start to see love in a different way. Because all of a sudden love becomes a reality and they go, why? And as Christians, the whole thing Paul was talking about, this is a choice of how you love somebody. That you make the choice to get in there. That you're willing to stay when it is hard. And the greatest example for all of us is our love for our children. Nobody has to tell you to love your children. When we're frustrated, depending on which side of that coin we're on, nobody has to tell you that. But see, when you stick in there with that and then with others, love never fails. I guess the thing I would tell you as we wrap this up, a Christ-like love, it bears with people when they are in the good times and in the bad. And they'll notice the bad much more than the good. They'll remember when you were there when it was hard. It bears with people. And it offers protection and trust when nobody else does. That's a choice about how we live and how we love. And when that happens, the thing that always gets me is the questions of why we go places. Why would we go to Ray City, Georgia? Why would we go to back and forth to Biloxi, Mississippi? Or Katrina, whatever the place may be, or into the schools, or wherever your mission is. When all of a sudden, when you're called into that trust, into that moment, then people start to see the love of Christ. Because they'll ask you why. And you just say, because my Jesus told me to love you, and I'm trying to do that because he loved me. See, Christ-like love bears with people and offers protection and trust when the rest of the world says it's over. I pray that you might be a vessel of that love and grace. That you might be willing to share that in the good times and in the bad. And that when you want to get up and run, that something will tell you to stay and sit a little while and bear their burdens with them. And out of that, they will know the love of our Jesus. Amen.